I should start by saying it wasn't anything dramatic. No candlelight, no thunderstorm, no movie scene. Just a knock at my door, 3 sharp raps, too precise for an accident, right around midnight. It's the kind of thing you don't forget, though, not because of the sound, but because of who was standing there. She lived 1 floor up, across the hall. I'd seen her in passing before, arms full of groceries, hair tied up too carelessly for someone who carried herself with that kind of poise. She always gave a polite nod, nothing more. A woman in her mid-40s, sure of herself in that quiet way people only get after they've lived long enough to know what matters and what doesn't. I opened the door that night with sleep still clinging to me, and there she was. She didn't smile, didn't look nervous either. She just said, low and calm, "Sorry to bother you this late. Do you have a screwdriver?" A screwdriver. That's all it was. I stood there too long before answering, realizing I didn't own one. 24 years old, and my toolbox consisted of duct tape and wishful thinking. I shook my head, mumbled something about maybe finding a butter knife. She gave this small laugh, not at me exactly, but it curled under my skin anyway. "Don't worry about it," she said, brushing it off like it didn't matter. But the way her hand lingered on the doorframe, tapping once before she turned, there was something there. Something she wasn't saying. The next morning, I saw her again. I was grabbing a coffee from the little shop on the corner, trying to wake up before work at the repair garage. She was at the counter ahead of me, already speaking to the barista like they'd known each other for years. I watched the way she leaned in, the way people leaned toward her in return. Not flirtatious, more like gravity. When she caught me watching, she raised an eyebrow. Just a flicker. I nearly looked away, but she beat me to it, sliding her coffee across the counter without waiting for cream or sugar. Confident. Self-contained. It should have ended there. 2 encounters in 2 days. Nothing special. But later that week, she came by the garage. Her car, an older silver sedan, needed an oil change. I spotted her before she saw me, standing a little straighter than usual, trying to look like I belonged among the older mechanics. She finally noticed me, tilted her head. "Didn't know you worked here. Didn't know you drove that," I said before thinking. Stupid. But she only smiled, tight-lipped, amused in a way that made me feel both smaller and strangely seen. While we waited for the paperwork, she didn't fill the silence with small talk. Most people do. She sat on the bench by the wall, arms folded, tapping 1 foot, her gaze cutting through the noise of clanging tools and radio static. I found myself checking the clock, not for my shift, but for how long she'd stay. At one point, she asked me if I ever regretted moving into the building. Just like that, out of nowhere. I shrugged. Not yet. She gave a half-smile, like she was testing me. Then she said, quieter, "Give it time." That night, lying in bed, I kept hearing the knock. 3 sharp raps. I kept seeing the way her eyes lingered on me at the garage. Not long, just long enough. It was nothing, and yet it wasn't. And that's the problem. Because ever since that midnight knock, I haven't been able to fall asleep without replaying it. Without wondering if she knew what she was doing when she stood outside my door, asking for something I didn't have. The next time we spoke, it wasn't at midnight and it wasn't in the garage. It was in the laundry room of our building, fluorescent lights buzzing, the air thick with detergent and heat. I'd gone down with a basket under one arm, headphones around my neck, half asleep from a long shift. She was already there, folding a stack of crisp white sheets. Not hurried, not distracted, just precise. The kind of person who folds corners to match. I almost turned around, but she noticed me. "You do your own laundry?" The way she said it, half teasing, half curious, made me stammer. "Sometimes, when it gets unbearable." She smirked, tucking a corner in tighter. Figures. I leaned against one of the machines, basket untouched. She didn't talk after that, and I didn't know if I was supposed to. So I just watched her, quietly, carefully, the way her hands moved, the faint vein along her wrist. How her laugh the other day in the hallway had been quick, but here, there was no laughter at all. She looked tired, not in the way of bad sleep, but in the way of someone carrying too much for too long. At one point she paused, sheet half folded, fingers pressing into the fabric like she'd forgotten what she was doing. Her jaw tightened, then loosened. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but the words sat heavy on my tongue. Instead, I offered the only thing I could. Need help? She blinked, like she hadn't realized I was still standing there. Then she shook her head. No, I've got it. But her voice didn't match the firmness of her answer. It dipped, softer, like maybe she wouldn't have minded if I had insisted. I nodded anyway, pretended to busy myself with loading a machine. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it wasn't light either. It was something else, something that pressed down, made every sound sharper. The slap of wet clothes hitting the drum, the hum of the dryer, the creak of her shoes when she shifted her weight. When she finally gathered her things, she brushed past me, her shoulder grazing mine. Barely a touch, but enough that my grip tightened around the basket. She stopped at the doorway, looked back once. You shouldn't waste your Friday nights down here, she said, like it was a warning. I wanted to tell her I didn't mind, that it wasn't wasted, that maybe I'd spend every Friday in a laundry room if it meant standing beside her while she folded sheets like they were the last fragile thing in her life. But I didn't say anything, and she didn't wait for an answer. Still, when the door clicked shut, I realized my heart was racing, and it wasn't because of the machines. It was raining the night she knocked again. Not midnight this time, closer to 10, but late enough that I was already stretched out on the couch, half watching a show I wasn't following. The knock was softer than before, almost hesitant. When I opened the door, she stood there with her umbrella dripping onto the hallway carpet, her hair damp, the collar of her coat turned up. She gave a quick nod, like she'd rehearsed it. Power's out in my place. Thought I'd wait it out here. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She slipped in, shaking rain from her sleeves, her perfume faint but cutting through the smell of wet fabric. I offered her the couch. She chose the chair. Always a little space between us. We sat there in the dim glow from the single lamp plugged into the emergency outlet. The rain hit hard against the windows, and for a while, neither of us spoke. She tucked her legs under herself, arms wrapped around her knees in a way that made her look less composed than usual, younger somehow. After a stretch of silence, she sighed. I hate storms. It surprised me. She didn't seem like someone who admitted to hating anything. I wanted to ask why, but before I could, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her face shifting, a flicker she didn't mean to show. Then she silenced the call without answering. I pretended not to notice, though my chest tightened. Whoever it was, she didn't want them intruding here. Was that? I started. Doesn't matter. Her tone was sharp, but then she softened, eyes on the floor. Just someone who shouldn't be calling. The air between us thickened. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, searching for words I didn't dare speak. That I liked having her here. That I didn't want the storm to end. Instead, I asked, "Do you want some tea?" She looked at me then. Really looked, and for a heartbeat too long, neither of us moved. "Tea would be nice," she said finally, her voice low. In the kitchen, my hands fumbled with the kettle. I could feel her behind me, quiet, waiting. When I turned with the mugs, she was standing closer than before, only a few feet away. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the damp strands of hair that had slipped loose. I held out the cup. She reached for it, and for the briefest moment, her fingers brushed mine, cool, trembling, but steadying as she wrapped around the handle. I didn't pull back right away. Neither did she. Then her phone buzzed again, slicing through the stillness. She exhaled sharply, set the cup down untouched. "I should go," she said, already pulling her coat tighter. The storm hadn't passed, but she didn't wait for me to argue. At the door, she paused, rain flickering in the hallway light behind her. For a second, it looked like she might turn, might say something else. Days passed after the storm. I told myself I wouldn't think about her, that I'd bury myself in work, in the clatter of tools and grease-stained rags. But every time the phone buzzed in the garage, every time a car door slammed outside, I caught myself glancing at the entrance like a fool. And then, one evening, I found her waiting in the hallway. No umbrella this time, no excuse like laundry or broken lights. Just her, leaning lightly against the wall by my door, as though she'd been there long enough to change her mind twice. "You're home," she said softly. "Yeah." My voice cracked more than it should have. We stood there, the air thick with something unspoken. Finally, she stepped inside without asking. I didn't stop her. She didn't sit this time. She walked to the window, looked out at the street, arms crossed like a shield. I stayed by the door, waiting, trying not to breathe too loudly. After a long stretch of silence, she spoke. This isn't normal. Her words hung in the room, heavier than anything either of us had said before. I swallowed. What isn't? She turned, and her eyes caught mine. There was no teasing, no guarded smirk. Just weariness. Whatever this is. These visits. Sitting in your apartment like I belong here. You don't. I asked before I could stop myself. Her lips parted, but she didn't answer right away. She stepped closer, then stopped halfway, caught between leaving and staying. You're 24, she said finally, her voice breaking on the number. And I'm not. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how small her words felt compared to the weight in her eyes. So, she said, sharper now, people talk. People notice. And I don't even know what we're doing. I wanted to cross the room, to take her hand, to tell her I didn't care what people thought. But my body wouldn't move. Instead, I forced out the truth that had been burning a hole in me. I don't either. The silence that followed was unbearable. She looked at me like she was searching for something, an exit, an answer, maybe both. My chest ached with the urge to say more, to close the distance, but the words jammed in my throat. Finally, she whispered, "You make it harder to be alone." The room stilled. My grip tightened on the back of a chair, every nerve sparking at once. She didn't move closer. Neither did I. But after that line, there was no going back. But she didn't. The door closed softly, leaving only the rain and the ghost of her hand against mine. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day nobody remembers. I was fixing a chain on one of the shop's old lifts when my phone buzzed with her name. She'd never called before. Her voice was clipped, almost businesslike. "Can you stop by later? I need help with something." When I showed up, she already had the door open, as if she'd been standing there waiting. No smile, no small talk, just a nod toward the table. A stack of old boxes sat there, lids half off, papers spilling out. "I'm clearing things out," she said, tugging her sleeve higher. "Too much junk." I offered to carry the heavier ones to the curb, but she shook her head. "No, just stay a minute." She pulled out a photo from one of the boxes and set it down between us. I leaned closer. A man stared back, broad-shouldered, sunburnt grin, arms slung around her younger self. They looked happy, careless. I didn't ask, but she must have seen the question on my face, because she said, "That was a long time ago." Her fingers lingered on the edge of the photo, pressing harder than necessary. "We were together almost 10 years. He wanted a family. I didn't. Or maybe I did, but by the time I said it out loud, it was too late. He left. I didn't know what to do with my hands. They felt clumsy, useless. So I shoved them into my pockets and tried to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry." She gave a brittle laugh. "Don't be. People make choices. Sometimes you only understand them after they've wrecked everything." I studied her face. Not the polished, untouchable version I'd seen in the hallway or at the garage. This was rawer, edges frayed. A tiredness that had nothing to do with laundry or storms. "You remind me of him sometimes," she said suddenly. That landed harder than I expected. I straightened, caught between pride and something else I couldn't name. "Is that good or bad?" She looked at me for a long moment, then shook her head. "It's not either. It's just dangerous." Silence. The hum of the refrigerator filled the room, louder than it should have been. She brushed the photo aside like it burned her and leaned back, folding her arms tight across her chest. I wanted to reach across the table, close the distance, take the weight from her hands. Instead, I said nothing. Because what could I possibly say? When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. Her hand lingered on the knob, and just before she opened it, she whispered, almost to herself, "You weren't supposed to matter this much." And then the door clicked shut behind me, leaving me on the other side, pulse hammering, knowing everything had shifted and there was no pretending otherwise. For 2 weeks, we barely spoke. Passing in the hall, a nod, maybe a faint smile. Enough to acknowledge each other, not enough to reopen the wound. I told myself it was better this way, that she'd said it herself. I wasn't supposed to matter. But one night, late, I heard another knock. Not sharp this time, not hesitant either, just soft, steady. When I opened the door, she stood there without her usual armor. No coat, no careful expression. Just her, tired and unguarded. "Can I sit?" she asked. I moved aside. She walked in, dropped onto the couch like she'd been carrying too much. I stayed standing for a moment before sinking down across from her. We didn't talk at first. The hum of the fridge, the faint traffic outside, it filled the silence. She sat with her hands clasped, thumbs running over each other, over and over. I watched, waiting. Finally, she spoke. "I shouldn't keep coming here." I nodded, throat dry. "Then why do you?" She looked at me then, really looked, like she'd been avoiding my face until this moment. Her eyes softened, and for once she didn't look away. Because it feels easier when I do. The honesty in her voice left me still. No teasing, no guardrails, just that quiet truth laid bare. "I don't know what this is," I admitted. "I'm not trying to push for something. I stopped, words faltering. "I just like being near you." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathed out slow. Then she shifted, leaned back, and patted the space beside her on the couch. No invitation in words, but enough. I crossed the room and sat down. Close, but not touching. The kind of closeness that hummed louder than any embrace. We stayed that way, shoulder to shoulder, staring at the blank TV screen. Every few minutes, I felt the brush of her sleeve against mine when she shifted slightly. Each time, neither of us moved away. At some point, she tilted her head back, eyes on the ceiling. "You know this can't go anywhere," she said, her voice almost breaking. "I know." And yet, she didn't finish. She didn't need to. The silence stretched, heavy but not suffocating. My hand rested on my knee, hers on the cushion between us. Slowly, so slowly, I let my fingers slide just close enough to touch the back of her hand. She didn't pull away. Her breath caught, then steadied. And after a moment, her fingers turned, lacing gently with mine. No words, no promises, just the two of us, holding on in the quiet, as if that single gesture said everything we couldn't. When she finally whispered, it wasn't an explanation or an apology. Let's just stay here a little longer. And that was enough. I don't know when exactly things shifted from chance encounters to something I carried with me everywhere. Maybe it was the midnight knock, maybe the storm, maybe the silence on my couch that spoke louder than words. What I do know is this. After her, I never looked at connection the same way. We didn't fall into some neat category, neighbors, friends, lovers. We weren't any of those things completely, but we weren't strangers anymore either. We were something harder to name. Something that left marks in the quietest of ways. I think about how guarded she was in the beginning. How her eyes would slide away when mine lingered too long. How her laugh always carried an edge, like she was keeping one part of herself tucked out of reach. And then, slowly, those small cracks appeared. A sigh she didn't mean to let slip. A photo left on the table. Her hand resting against mine, not pulling back. And me. I wasn't the same kid who thought a neighbor's late-night knock was just an inconvenience. I learned how silence can ache, how closeness can be heavier than distance, how sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what you say, it's what you don't. I can't pretend I have answers now. We never defined what we were, never drew neat borders around it. But in a way, that was the point. She taught me that love, or whatever lives in the same orbit as love, doesn't have to be packaged cleanly. It can be messy, uncertain, even temporary, and still matter more than anything else. There are nights when I still hear that knock in my head. 3 sharp raps. The start of something I didn't see coming. And when I remember the way she whispered, "Let's just stay here a little longer," I realize it wasn't about forever. It was about being present enough, brave enough, to hold the moment while it lasted. And maybe that's the only thing we can ever really promise each other. Not permanence. Just presence. So if this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?